So what you see here today is a very large redevelopment called South Street Landing. This brought new life and energy to this portion of the city. It was formerly an old rundown area of the city known as the Jewelry District. Well, the project started with the closure and the shuttering of a former power plant, coal-fired power plant, and it left a big void in this portion of the city. It was looked at several times by several different developers until finally the state purchased the property from Narragansett Electric at that time and looked at redeveloping this site. It was sold for $1 to the Heritage Harbor Museum Foundation, and then after that the state bought the property from the museum and decided to use it as a redevelopment into what is now called the Rhode Island Nursing Education Center. GZA has been involved from the beginning on this project. We originally looked at it for the private developers, and then we're looking at it for the museum. And then when the state purchased the property, there was a coalition of private developers. There was the state doing the nursing center, and then there was also the urban coastal greenway that was being redeveloped. There's many different stakeholders who were part of this project. Obviously, there was the private developer that worked on the entire facility. There was a brand new substation for the repowering of the Manchester Street station that was rebuilt when they closed the South Street station.
Because it was an old power plant, it had giant above ground storage tanks that stored petroleum to fuel the power plant. Originally, I was the project manager on the project. So basically helping the client through the regulatory process. And we basically had developed regulatory submittals to the Department of Environmental Management to address the contamination on site. And when they decided that the substation actually needed to be rebuilt, we got involved in that. And we had developed a remedial action work plan, which basically outlined the remedy for the property that was specific to the lot. But then it became sort of a lot of other players. The Dynamo House was looking to be redeveloped by another entity, as well as other parcels in the area.
In addition to the environmental and regulatory services, GZA was also the geotechnical engineer for the design and construction of the new 115 kV substation. Referred to as the super substation, it is one of the largest on the East Coast, providing power to over half the city of Providence, including the Fox Point Hurricane Barrier, Brown University, and 4 city hospitals. As it was a critical infrastructure, it was constructed several feet higher for future flood resiliency. The historic industrial property posed several underground challenges, including the remains of former power plant foundations, as well as buried coastal estuarine soils and compressible Providence silts. To address these challenges, a combination of driven pipe piles and drilled micropiles were used to support the critical equipment. In addition, pre-consolidation methods were used to allow soils to settle under the weight of new fill prior to construction of certain lighter weight equipment.
This site historically is an industrial waterfront, and subsurface conditions here are pretty challenging. Specifically with South Street Landing, we are reusing the existing foundations, timber pile foundations. And new building loads, the new fit out of the project, we really had to evaluate the existing foundations and figure out a way to reuse those and then supplement them with new drilled foundations where needed. One of the design challenges with Dynamo House, one of the design challenges with South Street Landing, was filling the basement. The building has a basement that was just below the water table, and looking at it from a design standpoint, adding normal weight fill into the basement would have overstressed the existing foundations. So we designed a lightweight cellular concrete fill system that could be added to that basement without overstressing the existing foundations. South Street Landing now is the Rhode Island Nursing Education Center. It also houses administrative offices for Brown University.
And this was a small parcel. It's only about 5.5 acres. And one of the big issues of all the plans I had here was we've got to get environmental permits. Crucial. And there's so many different agencies involved in this, from the Army Corps of Engineers to the Rhode Island Department of Environment Management, the Coastal Resources Management Council, to the Energy Facilities Siting Board. And they all wanted to have things done the way they would regulate normally. This is what's called a brownfield site. The soils are contaminated from historic use. Groundwater is contaminated in certain areas from historic uses. So we have to look at how much, and then we have to get involved in our environmental team, and they did a lot of the requirements of primarily Coastal Resources Management Council and Department of Environmental Management. And this had to have an urban coastal greenway here, which is a requirement of allowing the general public to walk along any water of the state. And that meant looking at evaluating this old wall. And we had our geotechnical group did that. Then we had our ecologist team came on board, and they also had to do a number of environmental aspects regarding the benthic environment here in the water, so that all the regulating agencies would be satisfied that we're not impacting the environment with constructing the walls here.
Early on in the planning stages of the Urban Coastal Greenway, GZA was approached to do an inspection of the existing seawalls that supported this length of the waterfront. There were some deteriorating steel sheet pile walls, crumbling concrete walls, and some granite block walls that were really in rough shape and didn't meet today's standard of care. This initial inspection resulted in GZA designing a replacement bulkhead to be installed in front of those deteriorating seawalls to support the new loading of the Urban Coastal Greenway. One design challenge we had was that there is a web of utilities behind these seawalls and also some aging infrastructure and some new infrastructure. We were limited by what we could support this bulkhead with. We couldn't install anything on the upland side, no anchors, so we ultimately ended up designing the bulkhead to be supported by steel raker H-piles installed outboard of the front face of the bulkhead.
GZA provided pretty much all the services that we provide on this project. We did all the geotechnical and foundation work for all the new structures. We did the environmental work, mainly because of the site, the location, and the environmental issues. But GZA was able to handle all of those, coordinate, and work with all the different stakeholders throughout the project to make sure that we took all of these problems and issues off their shoulders.
We were involved in so many different aspects of the project, not just from the substation redevelopment, but anytime they sort of had an issue, it was something where internally we would talk, we were like, yeah, we can help them out with that.
It's pretty incredible just to think back again to what it was before. Now when you stand on that bridge looking, it's a completely different city, and to have been a part of that, it's pretty incredible.